Coincidental.
All right, thanks for joining us here today. We have the special privilege of interviewing Karen Bray about her recent work, Grave Attending, a Political Theology for the Unredeemed. So we are really excited about this new work and for this to be our second feature, this sort of interview series that we're putting together with the Radical Theology Discussion Forum. And so first off, welcome Karen, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, I'm happy to be here.
All right, I'm gonna pass it over to Jordan. Jordan Miller is joining me here, and we have a couple other people on the line as well. And I'll pass it off to Jordan for the first question.
Well, Karen, the first thing that I just wanted to ask you for the purposes of this discussion, a lot of the folks on the forum who are interested in the book haven't gotten the chance to read it yet. I thought you might want to just introduce what the project is about, give us some of the contours that you're working with.
Yeah, thanks. So the project is, in large terms, a piece of constructive theology, but one that I would situate within political theology, by which I mean a theology, sometimes we would call it secular theology or post-secular theology, but a theology that is not looking to fit within a particular faith tradition. It's not a confessional theology in that way, but a theology that is offering theological interpretation and critique of so-called secular society, or sort of questioning the terms of the secular using theological frames. And in particular, it's a critique of what I'm calling neoliberal narratives of redemption and salvation. So the more productive you are, the more efficient you are, the more profitable you are, then you are saved from the wretched experience of being unworthy or really meaningless in a neoliberal society. So on the one hand, it's diagnostic, sort of how do we see that theology, the neoliberal theology, playing out in society, but it's also constructive. So it uses mainly from cultural studies. So Black studies, queer theory, Crip theory, which is critical disability theory, affect theory, to offer alternatives. If neoliberal salvation narratives are killing us, what are the alternatives of worth we might find? And I find them in those parts of theory. In some ways, then, it's also a supplement to political theology, which I think also often wants to critique capitalism, critique neoliberalism, but doesn't always engage those kind of marginalized fields or subjects written by marginalized people, which queer theory, Crip theory, affect theory, Black studies tends to be. So it is a construction, but also a supplement to the canon of political theology.
Excellent.
So I've had the chance to to be on a handful of panels with you in the past where I've heard you discuss some of what's gone into this book. I'm reminded of Jeff Robbins' comment that political theology hasn't been radical enough, and radical theology hasn't been political enough.
Yeah.
Here you're kind of intervening and saying neither have been moody enough, effectively. I thought you might be willing to talk a little bit specifically about your relationship to radical theology, again, given that we're the ones hosting this conversation.
Sure. Yeah, and I would say like moody enough or embodied enough or not honest enough about the bodies that are producing it. So, right, no theology is written disembodied, but theology often written within Eurocentric or masculinist discourses don't always have to be as overt about the ways in which those embodied experiences are feeding into the frames that they're doing in the same way other sort of contextual theologies have to be. And so I would say radical theology, when I first encountered it, felt like, I say this in the introduction, like a temporary home, like maybe I'm going to try this out, this might be where I land. I'm not a Christian, but I am a theologian. I am a theist that wavers between pantheism and panentheism. But I felt theology's purpose in the world. Like theology, even without God, has this purpose, purpose of critique, a purpose of construction, to sort of rethink the faith narratives, including the faith narrative of neoliberalism that's killing us. And radical theology, allowing for a theology after the death of God, felt like a temporary home. But the more and more that I read radical theology, there were a lot of terms that to me felt really disembodied. Terms of the event, terms of kind of, I'm trying to think other terms, but just kind of revolution without bodies, or radicalism without a rootedness in bodies, even though there's that play with the term root. And so I was drawn to it. I thought, like, this could be a theological home, but where is the flesh here? Or where is the honesty about that the flesh that's been here for a long time is white male flesh? And what does that mean for who can be in the room? And so the moodiness for me is kind of the moodiness that Sarah Ahmed talks about, where it says you don't just enter a room in a mood, but with a history. And oftentimes those histories are moody histories. And I think, you know, it's why I also sort of feel like I have one foot in the forum and one foot out, because occasionally the forum is doing a great job of complicating the moody histories of radical theology. And occasionally kind of the tenor of the conversation, once again, tends to feel relatively anti-feminist or anti-trans or problematically white. Not because of the people who lead the forum, but because I think radical theology hasn't been politicized enough by the kind of bodies that have been on its margins. And I think, you know, Jeff is right, that political theology hasn't been always radical enough in that it's still tried to stay within a kind of authoritative lineage. Like if we even just think about how much it still tries to go back to Carl Schmitt and doesn't look to the margins. At least radical theology is often looking to marginalize itself, which is a political move. So I think there's sort of both. But for both, what I want to say is we are always writing from our bodies, always from our context, and we need to be moody together, partly to raise the problematic histories of our fields.
So you were just mentioning this idea that we write from a context, and it seems like the overwhelming context for your work is neoliberalism, which becomes this sort of the defining kind of boogeyman of this text. It's sort of the main bad guy. That, and maybe to a lesser extent, it seems like maybe radical orthodoxy. It's sort of its theological henchman. And so my question is sort of this: that word gets used a lot in a lot of different in a lot of different contexts, and often it feels synonymous with capitalism or capitalism in the 21st century or something along those lines. I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit about like what exactly do you mean by neoliberalism? How particularly are you using it in this context?
Yeah, so I mean, at base, my definition of neoliberalism is a system that measures every part of our lives by profit maximization or by market rationality. So there is no private life anymore. There is no time off. Everything is measured by the metrics of how profitable you are. So were you productive today? Did you save time? One of the lines I say in the book is that no one ever says like, Justin is such a great unitasker, right? Like we're constantly being driven by how productive we are, whether or not we're getting technically paid for it or not. So work and home don't make much sense anymore under neoliberalism. And I actually think Wendy Brown's Undoing the Demos has great definitions of neoliberalism and how it seeps into sort of every part of our lives. So for those sort of wanting a kind of more solid grounding in that, that's a good place to go. I think that also in the chapters, there's sort of different targets. So neoliberalism is pervasive, but you know, in the chapter 2, radical orthodoxy and also some radical theology become targets for critique and supplement. But as you move forward, some liberal theologies end up being really, to me, part of the problematic ethos of productivism within neoliberalism. Chapter 4 takes on Jack Caputo, you know, even in his radicality, I think, of not sort of, again, having the kind of embodied mood that I'm looking for. So it really is kind of saying that, unfortunately, neoliberal logic seeps into even our most radical or liberal of theologies, including neoliberal logic that's fortified by heteropatriarchy and white supremacy. So by the end, I'm even sort of critiquing myself for the ways in which the book hasn't dealt with Blackness enough, but that the targets include me sort of by the end, because neoliberalism isn't this thing happening outside of us, but happening through us, similar to white supremacy and heteropatriarchy.
I'll pass to you, Jordan, if you'd like to hop in.
Yeah, I'm looking over some of the questions that came in on the discussion forum. And there's this kind of trio of questions here that lists some of the traditional touchstones of a lot of the topics that you're working with. There's a question about Schmitt on political theology, a question about personal identity with Kierkegaard, and then a point about negative affect or sad passions and Spinoza. And you touched on this briefly with kind of a passing comment on Schmitt a minute ago. I just wondered if you would talk about why those characters and other figures like them in the history of these ideas aren't touchstones for you, like why you went a different direction.
Yeah, so I'll talk about that. I also went through the questions and tried to come up with some things to say, even though none of those three make it into my book very much. There's maybe like one sentence about Schmitt, nothing about Kierkegaard, and I think maybe a footnote about Spinoza. So one, why not have those in there? The one that I'm most passionate about not having in there is Carl Schmitt. So one of the frustrations, I think, for a lot of us who do what we would call political theology is the need to track that lineage back to Schmitt, right? And then if not Schmitt, maybe Metz and Zola and like other Germans, right? But Schmitt to me is the most problematic. Not that Schmitt isn't influential, and I talk about in the book the ways in which Schmitt helps us to see, right, that like all modern concepts of the state are secularized theological concepts. The way he helps us to see that theology is necessary, even in the so-called secular sphere. I don't like where he then goes with it, obviously, but for me, really problematic is to go to conference after conference, supposedly around political theology, and have everyone tied to Schmitt as the origin, when in fact, like, womanist theology is political theology, right? Queer theology is doing political theology. Why we're not, Jordan often brings up Marcel Altos Reed in the forum, and I'm really grateful for that. But because we're looking for someone who's bringing in deconstructionist thinkers, who's bringing in Deleuze and Derrida, and also decolonial thinking, the thinking of a queer woman, why aren't we should be going to Marcel Altos Reed before we just keep defaulting to the same canon of people? And so when we say that political theology has to be traced from Schmitt, we are ignoring theology written from the margins that's also political, that's also has just as authoritative of a critique. And I think particularly the problem is people assume that those theologies are not authoritative in their critique because they're not using the same tools of critique that Schmitt is using. So I in particular wanted in my work to not go to the traditional guise as much, and instead to make the construction out of fields of theory that are outside of kind of traditional political or radical or secular theological thinking. So Schmitt in particular, I want to engage the least. I think the question from Burke about Kierkegaard is a really interesting one. Kierkegaard is just not someone who I studied. So, and also, right, I'm not trying to look to European men to answer the question of how do we construct something counter to neoliberalism, even if they might be useful. I'm trying to look to people that we don't often think of as useful or important and raise them up. And part of my methodology, which is not a serious one, but I'm okay with it, it's a low theory methodology, as Jack Halberstam would say, is what text stuck to me. Like just when I started to think about mood and depression and theology or politics, what books stuck to me? And Kierkegaard was not one of them. Spinoza was not one of them, even though Spinoza is a really important thinker for affect theory in general. But beyond that, though, I think this question of Kierkegaard, and particularly anxiety that Burke was trying to raise, in which for Kierkegaard, anxiety is not a negative emotion. Anxiety is a fundamental emotion towards our own freedom or towards our own authenticity. I think that does align with sort of my desire to depathologize negative emotions and say, like, not what's wrong with me, I'm depressed, but why am I depressed? What can my depression do? How can my depression mess with time, right? Slow down time. How can my mania mess with time? Speed up time. Like, how do these emotions diagnose a sick world? How do they give me freedom from a world that won't allow me to feel the extremity of my feelings? And I think that ties then to Matt's question about Spinoza and affect as well, even though I don't engage Spinoza specifically, but this sort of question of, if for Spinoza's time, society, is pushing towards the sad passions, and in our time, we're being pushed towards the happy passions, then part of the call of the book is to allow yourself to feel the resistant moods. But the risk of the book, which I think Matt was getting at, is like, then do I glorify the sad passions, right? Do you risk then glorifying negative affect and saying, okay, the answer is just to all be depressed, or, you know, to make depression some ontological solution. And I'm having pregnancy brain for a second, but there's a book called Gut Feminism. Elizabeth, I'm forgetting her last name, but in Gut Feminism, she warns us, she says, listen, feminist theorists of affect, stop assuming negative emotion is what's going to save us. Like, it can't be, right? It's always pharmacon, as Derrida would say. Like, everything that you think is cure is also your curse. And I think that's a fair critique of some of where I want to go. But deep inside my book is really this kind of bipolar time thing. It's not just depression, it's also the mania. It's to say, where do these emotions lead us? If we started to find them interesting and not problematic, where could they lead us? If we started to say, I could have unrestricted joy when things are joyful, but I could also have the depths of despair when things are despairing without being judged about my self-worth, what could these emotions do? And I don't have an ultimate answer, but I want us to slow down enough to follow our moods where they might take us.
I just looked it up quickly while you were talking. It's Elizabeth Wilson.
Thank you. It was
that kind of trajectory that you're talking about with sitting with the affect, whatever it happens to be, reminds me of a conversation that some of us were having with you at the AAR a few months ago about the way in which you deal with redemption and unredemption. Mm-hmm. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I remember the exact specifics of our conversation, but you know, the subtitle of the book, A Political Theology for the Unredeemed, is certainly a critique of redemption in the manner in which that I think redemption often includes marking others as unredeemed, right? So that our redemption is often bought by assuming an irredeemable character of others. So the grave attending at the title of the book is really not just about sitting with my own mood, but sitting with, I like to say, the wound that birthed me. So like, if my good citizenship was bought through the ransom of Black women, then I need to sit and gravely attend to that ransom, or to the kind of ways in which women of color have been marked as irredeemable in a particular sort of salvific narrative of femininity or something like that. So I'm really skeptical of redemption. On the panel on my book at AR, Mary Jane Rubenstein said, like, well, is this really a counter-redemption? Like, are you actually saying, look at all these other ways we might go, and that's really a counter-redemption and not an unredemption? And yeah, maybe. I guess what I want, though, is in some ways to get out of the ransom or the kind of financial, the exchange value rate of redemption. And I'm looking for terms that help us to get out of that way. And unredemption for me was that, or sort of sticking with the irredeemable. But to stick with the irredeemable might be a counter-redemption without a solid vision. So as long as that counter-redemption isn't teleological, then I'm okay with the term counter-redemption. But unless we can get to that point, then for me, unredemption makes more sense.
So you talk about this kind of unredemption and or counter redemptions. What I wonder is that something that I didn't see a lot of in the text was this sort of concrete language of political alternatives. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what maybe was a reticence to use language like socialism or communism or other language that you might see in other political theologies, that at least from my perspective, it felt consciously like it was explicitly chosen to not be here. And I was wondering if you could talk about if that was explicit, and if so, why?
Yeah, thanks. I'm trying to think if it was conscious or not. I definitely think part of it was to not offer a certain program. So that, like, kind of what I want is for us to leave space for new things to be discovered together, or new collectivities to be discovered together. And so I think I was trying to maybe avoid terms that offered a clear idea of a program. And there are a couple of moments, like in the chapter on unproductivity, where I talk about Kathy Weeks, and I talk about the ways in which in her kind of anti-work politics and post-work thinking, she does offer some like concrete utopian things that would need to happen, like not in an Andrew Yang way, but she has a guaranteed basic income as a policy demand that would be a utopian demand that would allow for a kind of post-work life. So there are little moments like that come into the work, but I'm really drawn to introduction to The Undercommons, written by Stefano Harney and Fred Moten, Jack Halberstam writes that basically we have to tear shit down because we can't even know who's with us until you tear shit down. Like, there's no way to see new ways of becoming as long as we're blocked off from each other from the walls. And so the book for me actually is kind of constructive through deconstruction in that way of saying, how do we start to find each other if we can't slow down enough to pay attention to one another, and also let the parts of ourselves that have been bought through the ransoming of others become undone? I don't know who I'm going to be as an actor after gravely attending to those I've ransomed. I'm not sure yet what that identity looks like, but it's like kind of an in-process thing. I will say, Jordan and I were on a panel together at the Political Theology Network conference in October, where my paper was much more, proposed a much stronger subject maybe than the book ends with. So like, we were on a panel with someone else who's very into kind of the desubjectivating impulse, particularly in Foucault, which comes up partly in my chapter with Whitehead and Foucault, which I'm drawn to, but I basically end up saying, like, having tarried with all this negative affect and having sort of thought about the undoing of these systems, I'm now wanting more. And at the time I was writing kind of on pleasure activism and the wanting of more pleasure or more joy. Like, once we've undone this, like, no is not enough, right? Which is like part of that in the Naomi Klein book, but that no is good, and kind of politics of refusal and politics of slowdown are good. But then how do we make the building of community and the struggle and collaboration joyous and pleasurable, right? So not just how do we respond to our depression by living with it, which I think we do need to do, but then how do, through that depression, do we find others to be depressed with in such a way that is also joyful? And so I think that's like where my next project is going, like a more kind of concrete plan of activism. I'm skeptical, say, like I've been reading Jody Dean's Comrade. I like the idea of kind of academics changing our positionality from professional or competitor to comrade. I'm a little skeptical of their over faith in kind of an old school CP, like old school communist party. I'm not skeptical of socialism at all, but I think like kind of the party, capital P, risks its own kind of programmatic salvation narrative. And I was thinking instead there's a book called After the Party, which is written by Joshua Chambers Letson, who's a performance studies scholar at Northwestern who was a mentee of Jose Esteban Munoz, which might be more familiar to some of the people in the forum. And in After the Party, he talks about a communist party divorced from the CP, and it's a communist party of people gathered together in the wake of Munoz's death. And the ways in which community for people of color, for queer people of color, trans people of color, is about survival in such a way that, like, through the death that stalks them, they become a party. And I think there's something there, but it's like, I don't want the kind of big CP title to it, but I do want to find ways of building our own little c communist party of pleasurable activism in the wake of taking the time to feel the depression, the anxiety, and all those other supposedly negative emotions.
Your response, this appeal to sort of moreness and pleasure and excess and things along those lines, it fits so well with sort of the Munoz approach, which I think offered this much more sort of positive, sort of like a Deleuzian and character, in comparison to, for example, to like Lee Edelman, who I love, but is really dark. It's a dark take. And so I'm thinking here of people like the way that like Marcella Althus-Reed uses Bataille, for example, to create this sort of libertine theology of excess, where, you know, where austerity is constantly telling us, shut down. You have to be happy, but we refuse to give you anything to be happy with. And so there's this excessiveness to your work that I find really appealing. I was wondering if you could just speak, I don't really have a formulated question here, but if you could just speak a little bit about that moreness, that excess, that sort of outward going explosiveness that I think there's something really profound to.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, I think I've always been drawn more towards Munoz over Edelman, and too much to the annoyance of some other people working with queer temporality. and even in my chapter on bipolar time and sort of thinking about queer temporality as an important supplement to radical theology, or to the conversation between radical theology and radical orthodoxy, I defer to Munoz over Edelman, even though, right, I'm also offering kind of depression and a politics of refusal, because I think the depression is not about nihilism. It's actually about hope in some ways, a kind of moodier hope, right? An uncertain hope that, like, we don't have to be going the way of neoliberalism. There are other ways we could be together, but it is about a being together. It is this kind of cruising utopia, creation of utopia through subculture that Munoz offers us. And the person who actually comes to mind, which I talk a little bit about in the chapter that deals with critical disability theory, Crip theory, is Eve Sedgwick writing about Gary Fisher. So it's actually Robert McGruer writing about Eve Sedgwick writing about Gary Fisher, the Gary Fisher in My Pocket. And Gary Fisher, who was a Black gay man who identified as a sociopath and who was also dying of AIDS. And he refused to take some of his medications, partly as a kind of resistance to the attempt to cure him of sociopathness or of diseaseness. He wanted to kind of, death was not the scariest thing, but like wanting to live a more life. And he openly identified as queer, Black, and sociopathic, and wanted that label sociopathic. And he, in it, he talks about, there's a quote that I use that says, it says like the certain number of people who will have AIDS by the end of the decade. And he says, but I'm less afraid. It's a big, big room and it's full of everybody's hope. And in some ways, my reclamation of negative affect is not about divorcing yourself from that room or getting out of that room alone. It's about like, actually, how do we occupy that big, big room more authentically and really full of everybody's hope, like full of the people whose hope is still outside that room. So I talk a little bit about one of my students in my political theology class a couple of years ago, this Black woman who said, what if political theology is the breaking of windows, right? And some of Jordan and I have been on a bunch of panels at AR together about kind of property and proper relationships. And sort of the breaking of the window is about expanding the room, but it's also about shattering one room in preference to the outside, right? Or if we think about Dolores Williams, in preference to the wilderness. But the wilderness is about everybody, is about survival. It's not about escape. It's escape from one thing into a different type of community. So the excess is not, the negative affect is not individualistic. It's always communal in some way.
So just one last question, and then I'll give back to Jordan for just a moment. This recourse to hope that you have here, I think highlights something that seems really important, which is the distinction in your work between hope and optimism, which is a project that I've been doing a lot of work on as well. And so thinking, with somebody like Lauren Berlant, Cruel Optimism, things along these lines, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the way that the notion of hope that seems operative in your work doesn't seem to be the same thing as an optimism, and in really many ways can't be, because optimism is sort of the demand of neoliberalism in to a certain extent.
Yeah, so I think again it's sort of in some ways about teleology or telos, that like optimism has this faith in an end that I'm not sure hope always does. And in fact, even in this book at least, I don't use hope so much as maybe salvage or survivance. So Gerald Visner has this idea of survivance or survivance, depending on how French you feel like being in the moment, where the way you survive in the wake of someone trying to kill you or kill your people can be an active form of resistance. So it's not, again, this sort of goes to my sense of Holy Saturday, this Saturday between crucifixion and resurrection. It's not that I like survived in such a way that I was resurrected and made whole. The trauma still exists. This is, I get a lot from Shelley Rambo, but the survivance is that I'm going to survive in such a way that actually is a dismantling of the systems that tried to kill me. And I think that that's hopeful. It's not optimistic. I'm not sure we get to be resurrected, right, or made whole again after the system tried to kill us, but we can live in such a different way, in a way that's different, that is resistance itself, that like life itself becomes resistance in some way, or survival itself becomes not just bare survival, but a different type of survival through survivance. Or similarly, preferring salvage over salvation, right? The salvaging, which you can get some from Whitehead, not I'm going to get saved out of the wretchedness, but I'm going to collage, I'm going to salvage, I'm going to like take the shit and make some way of living in it that's different or has a critical difference than what, again, the system that tried to keep me there did. So it's not, there's not an end, there's not a clear end, which also is partly why there's not like a kind of, here's the solution now to neoliberalism at the end of the book. It's how do we better survivance together? How does my survivance empower your survivance? How does your survivance empower mine? Not how do we resurrect together? How do we get back to some false sense of wholeness?
Sorry, I'm clicking around at the various questions that have come in from a handful of different places here. I think there's an interesting question from Preston Price about the role of Crip theory in disability studies and what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of folks aren't familiar with what that is to begin with. Could you introduce it and then talk about its place in your project?
Yeah, so I like to say when I'm talking to my students that Crip theory is to kind of like disability rights rhetoric as queer theory is to gay rights rhetoric. So Crip theory is a kind of disability politics or critical disability studies that instead of asking how can those who are so-called disabled get access to the norm or normativity, instead, actually, how can we take the position of the disabled to fuck with the norm or to like question the norm itself? So Robert McGruer, who's one of my favorite Crip theorists, has this line where he says like, we want to say, fuck employability, I'm too sick to work, right? Not how can we make employability more accessible to more people, but how can we, those of us who feel ourselves to be sick or who are sick, help society question the importance of employability. So it might be a deaf activist who refuses the cochlear implant and says like, I don't need to hear for you, you all need to learn sign language for me, right? How do we take our disabilities and say, actually, these are ways of moving and looking through the world that would be helpful to so-called normative culture because normative culture itself is sick. So that's sort of where I would say the kind of definition of Crip theory is. Do you want me to expand on its use in my work, or is there like a specific direction you want?
Yeah, no, if you would talk about how that supplements the kind of theological arc that you're working with.
Yeah. So first, I think, again, if we go back to the kind of Holy Saturday analogy where we say like, the crucifixion has happened, like the trauma is on my body or my psyche or my soul, and I'm not looking for resurrection back into a society that was trying to kill me in the first place. But if we stayed in Saturday, if we actually stayed in the wake of crucifixion and lived life with a critical difference, what type of survivance, what type of kind of new lower C communist party might there be? And I think Crip theorists are doing that maybe better than anybody else. They're not necessarily doing it in a theological language, although there are some theologians like Sharon Becher who picks up Crip theory and does constructive theological work with it. But Crip theory is asking, like, what would it mean to slow down, right? Instead of rushing over the person who has to walk slowly because of an invisible disability up the stairs of the subway, what if we all walked at that pace? Like, how would time shift? How would productivity shift? And in particular, I'm critical of even liberal theological productivism. It sort of wants to define our worth through how productive we are for the social whole. So even though I have like great respect for Kwok Hui-lan and Jorg Rieger, in their book, Occupy Theology, I think is the title, they talk about this parable in the Bible where there's a so-called invalid who's sitting on his mat and Jesus commands like to take the mat and walk, right? And that their point is sort of about kind of the labor that we can do productively together, the productivity of the multitude that they get from Hart and Negri, right? That like to be a disciple is to be a productive laborer. And they're trying to like resist a kind of Mitt Romney, we built this bullshit trickle-down economy thing, which is important. But my worry is the risk that when you're asking the person to take their mat and walk, you're not asking why were they sitting in the first place. And what Crip theory asks us to do is say like, why is employability? Like, the thing I'm supposed to do? For whom would I be so-called getting well? And so I think it does a better job than a lot of theologies do about questioning not just neoliberalism, but liberal theology that ties salvation to a particular type of productivity or a particular type of worth. And Crip theory is really dismantling ideas of worth that are so tied to able-bodiedness, which are tied to capitalism, which are tied to white supremacy, all the tied to heteropatriarchy. Crip theory and queer theory overlap a lot.
I think you see, for example, exactly what you're talking about theologically speaking, operative in the work of Paul, where there are these periodic demands for productivity. This idea that you shouldn't be lazy or something, and look at me, I'm a tent maker, et cetera, et cetera. And so, but I think I find myself of two minds for these sorts of texts, because on the one hand, I think that this critique of productivism is really, really important right now in our society. And yet there's also I think sort of a radical counter reading of these passages that points to the fact that in the ancient world, like, there was no welfare system, these stereotypes you have nowadays of, like, the welfare queen, the sort of racist stereotype of Reagan, and all these images, that when Paul says, don't be lazy, his target is the rich. So I'm wondering if you could talk about the sort of dual character of that, which I know is getting into what you were just discussing, but if you could speak a bit more than that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's partly why sort of all of my chapters are structured as contextual thought experiments. Like, in particular, my chapter on the Bible, where I sort of look to Jonah and Martha as what I call affect alien prophets, taking from the term affect alien from Sarah Ahmed. I'm not trying to say, like, here's the right way to read Paul, or here's the right way to read Jonah or Luke. I'm saying, like, what would it mean if we took the side of the character who's not supposed to be the hero? Like, what could we learn about our own society? So again, for what Rieger and Kwok are trying to do, which is to try to write a theology for the 99%, to kind of look to the productivity of the multitude or to laborers makes sense. What I want to say is, okay, but then again, who did you just ransom to redeem the laborers?
Yeah.
So I'm always trying to push at, even for those of us doing good liberal theology, who are we ransoming for that? So, for instance, with the Jonah situation, reading Jonah in a context in which you are trying to argue against anti-Semites who think that the Hebrew Bible is all just about vengefulness and the New Testament is about forgiveness, I understand a reading of Jonah where you can say, like, see, God is showing mercy in the Hebrew Bible. My problem is, who then is, like, how is Jonah as a Hebrew being condemned in that story, right? So it's always about looking to, or like in the Mary and Martha story, to say, you could read that in a great way to say, see, Martha, you shouldn't be doing housework, right? Lots of sort of early wave feminist biblical interpreters are going to say, Mary got to get out of the kitchen and learn from Jesus. And I'm going to say, but who's being ransomed for Mary's redemption there, right? So that it's not to make any one character, any one emotion the hero or the villain. It's to always say, once you're making a redemption of one character, who is going irredeemed? And how do we pay better attention to that character?
You just brought up attention. I think we might want to talk about the title a little bit. Could you talk about just what you mean by grave attending?
Yeah. So it has a kind of dual meaning for me. One is to slow down, to like be pulled down by the gravity of what is. And in some ways, to me, it's like a little bit resistance to, in radical theology and deconstructive thought, in sort of continental thought, the event, right? Or kind of like exodus, movement, even from a radical point of view. And to say, like, actually, we don't need movement. Certainly, it's kind of a critique of accelerationists. Not that that's where radical theology is going, but to say, like, no, actually, we need to be brought down by the gravity of what is, because we're missing something in the speed of our time. We're not attending to who is being ransomed, even in our good liberal or radical stories or theologies. So it's about gravely attending, which gravity can have a grave character to it, but it's really about slowing down. The other part of it is a kind of a hauntology, which I am getting a lot from, particularly try to tease out in my chapter on Whitehead and Foucault, but particularly from Foucault, that says, instead of waiting for some kind of new inbreaking, like a kind of Badooian event, that something, there's like a radical newness that's going to break in and save us. That actually, what if we were haunted by all the possibilities and collectivities and parts of ourselves that society tried to kill off and bury over, that the hegemony tried to kill off and bury over. So literally sitting and being haunted by the ghosts of those you ransomed or who were ransomed for redemption, and sitting at the graves and allow yourself to be haunted by the bodies at the bottom of the ocean in the Middle Passage. What alternative forms of community would there almost has a kind of Afrofuturism hope to it. It's an imagining of what kind of utopians could have been if we could be haunted by all those things that were put in the closet, put in the asylum, killed, tried to stay in the grave. And the reason I say I got that someone from Foucault is because Foucault has this line, he says, we might become again what we never were. Right, which is a very, my students like really get hung up on that grammatical formation. Like, how could we become something again that we never were in the first place? But his point is really about, like, this is from History of Madness, like, what could we have been if madness and unreason were allowed to be equal parts to us as reason, right? So it's a thing from the past, but it's not a thing that was ever allowed to be. So grave attending is a lot about being haunted by what was, so that it actually might be again, right? Not just that we can be mournful and despairing that we didn't get to be that in the first place, but precisely to give us tools, images, dreams of something better than what we have today.
I think that that sort of grave attending that you're pointing to, I think could be really informative in contemporary radical theology circles, in the sense that you have in somebody like John Caputo, for example, this idea that the death of God is always already the birth of God. And you use this motif of Holy Saturday, and that's how I often feel myself wanting to be like, slow down, like let us at least like live in the death of God before we immediately are trying to recuperate it in a positivity. Because like, I think there is value, as I think you show, to allowing us to sink into that Holy Saturday experience and not always be projecting ourselves already to the Sunday that's kind of always already emerging or something along those lines.
Yeah, and I owe a deep debt to Shelley Rambo in her book, Spirit and Trauma, where she really, really pushes a Holy Saturday theology precisely because of that concern about the need to rush to Sunday. And if we think about kind of Christian worship, how often are people actually celebrating Saturday, right? In fact, it's like, we got to get to Easter Sunday. Like, we know, thank God we know how the story ends. And she quotes, I'm trying to remember, I think Cornel West basically saying that, like, to live a life of blackness is to live a kind of Holy Saturday life. Like, you can't, the idea that we can rush to Sunday is painful. And for Rambo, because she does also work with lots of people with PTSD, she's like, you cannot be someone who is severely traumatized who thinks that life fully conquers death. To live with PTSD is to live a life penetrated by death. It's still a life, right? I would call it still a survivance, but you can't pretend that the trauma isn't there, right? And I think particularly on the left, we live in the crucifixion of so many failed revolutions. And instead of sitting long enough in the wake of those failed revolutions to really think about the failures and to find new ways of connecting, we immediately want a program. But that program is so eerily familiar to the failed program, right? It's like, we're not really good at actually attending to history. So yeah, I think both kind of as leftist organizers and theologians, the need for a positive image or salvation at the end is preventing us from seeing maybe a deeper long-term strategy.
I mean, you see this in at least popular representations of Occupy Wall Street, right? The refusal to issue concrete demands. I mean, there was other stuff going on there. It wasn't, kind of a unanimous decision to go that route. But the idea that that kind of a moment in American political and social history would emphasize process and relationality over and against whatever the program could be, is really remarkable that it had such a huge impact. I don't really have a question there, but I mean, that's a really interesting resonance for me with your work, that emphasis on process.
Yeah, and I think, I forget if I actually included this in Grave Attending or not, but at some point, Zizek was critiquing Occupy Wall Street because he was saying, well, now you're just going to go back to everyday life. Like, you didn't make a concrete change, now you're going back to everyday life. And Halberstam, it's either Halberstam or Butler, I think it was Halberstam, says he doesn't get it. The point of Occupy Wall Street is everyday life is now radically changed, right? So the actually not having a program is what allows everyday life to have changed. To come up with these like concrete proposals that could just be checked off would be to be giving into the logics of everyday life that was already on the table. And for me, one of the most powerful lessons, so my students who, like, this kills me to say, but of course were born in like 2000, 2001, 2002. They don't remember Occupy Wall Street. They don't remember the Occupy movement. That most of them were raised in Georgia means that they were not coming from union households, right? Labor, obviously, union organizing, union busting in the South is horrendous. They don't have a sense of that kind of power. And so one of the things I like to do, because oftentimes at the end of my classes, like, they're pretty despairing about the world. I mean, we have a lot of fun. I just like to say, like, you can have a lot of joy while you're getting each other depressed about the world, is to map from Occupy Wall Street to be able to have a field of Democratic presidential candidates who have to deal with some form of universal health care, right? Yes, there's fights about what it's going to look like, but can you imagine 10 years ago that being a conversation on such a mainstream political stage? So the idea that Occupy Wall Street was a failure because it wasn't programmatic is just bullshit, right? And it's a problematic, or anyone who's been a professional organizer, I was a union organizer for years. Yes, you have to have different strategies and whatever, but if you think that you're gonna like have a straight line from what you want to what you get, you are already setting yourself up for failure, and not the good kind of queer failure that Halberstam offers us. So yeah, I think Occupy is incredibly important for the kind of process I'm talking about.
Hey, Chris, are you there? Looks like he's coming in. I think he might chime in, but I know that he was wondering about how your work engages with Adrienne Maree Brown. I know you brought that up a little while ago about pleasure and joy. But while we're talking about program or lack thereof, I'm wondering if you can just elaborate on some of that a little bit about where kind of these positive interventions come in through the negative affect.
Mm-hmm. So the book we're talking about right now does not engage directly with Adrienne Maree Brown, and I was introduced to her work later, right after. And that's one of the funny things about talking about a book that just came out, but that you actually wrote a couple of years ago, or started a couple of years ago, which for all of us who've done writing projects know that that's how that goes. But I've started reading Pleasure Activism, which, so for those of you who don't know Adrienne Maree Brown, she also wrote a book called Emergent Strategy. She has a podcast with her sister called How to Survive the End of the World, which is actually how I first started listening to her. And she's a specialist in Octavia Butler. So How to Survive the End of the World is like the first podcast is called God is Change. And they're doing actually Black feminist, speculative fiction, radical theology. Like, if we're going to co-opt them, which is not my favorite thing to do in this forum, but right, the kind of theology that it's processy, it's kind of alternative forms of community. And so in Pleasure Activism, one of the things Brown says is like, how can we make the struggle the most pleasurable thing we can do? And a lot of times that's actually not about putting cause over person or program over process. It's actually very much about process. How do you feed people well? How do you take dance breaks? How do you allow for pleasure as a demand not just a policy outcome. One of my next project might be, we'll see, called Democratizing Pleasure, where I want to ask kind of what kind of pleasure practices increase our desire and demand for democracy, and how can we democratize time and space that more people actually get time for pleasure. So it's kind of a dual thing. And I think for me, union organizing was wonderful and also horrible. It was like one of the times in my life where I was the most, my psyche was the most abused, right? I still believe in labor organizing, but it was not, the pleasure of the people doing it was never at the center of anything. In fact, it was okay to burn people out because the program was more important than the people. Teaching for me, which isn't activism, is totally different. Like the way I think about how do we raise consciousness of young people who are trying to be global actors, even as you're trying to tell them about, like, where I live, Macon, Georgia, was the most redlined city in the country in some of the 1930s, and we still have the effects of that. Or like, even as we're sort of talking about what it is to live in the wake of enslavement or to live under patriarchy. To make that experience joyful, to me, is the only way that activates them long-term to fight for changing the situation. So, and I'm indebted to Adrienne Maree Brown for that insight. I think I was like already doing it in my teaching, but I didn't understand the importance of it for long-term struggle building until she sort of articulates it in that book.
So Chris just messaged me here on the side. You've covered some of this, but just it helps for the clarity of his question. Regarding communal practice, how might that intersect with your work in emergent strategy, where the transformative vision becomes the praxis? And then Chris clarifies, as a pastor, he's interested in communal praxis, where systems that are bankrolled on toxicity and the Christian legacy are transformed into life-giving practices of community.
Yeah, so I'll admit I haven't read Emergent Strategy yet. So I started backwards with pleasure activism. I know that like several pastor friends of mine, particularly the Reverend Molly Hausch-Gordon, who's a Unitarian Universalist pastor in Columbia, she is a huge believer in emergent strategy, and she started to try to run her meetings at her church around this, right? And my understanding of it, first of all, it's like very, of course, grounded in process. If the strategy is emergent, you mean you have to understand that the strategy is going to change. That is not always how leftist groups or institutions work. In fact, right, like one of our biggest problems is the flexibility to change. One of the things in pleasure activism that I really find important, besides sort of paying attention to the pleasure of the people in the room or the bodies of the people in the room, like, is who's in the room. So sometimes we're not really good at figuring out who needs to be in what room to do what thing. And we all know, because we've either been part of academia or faith communities that we're running, any kind of institution we're running, that you get someone in the room who's not willing to change their vision or not willing to hear other people, and the strategy is going to fail even if it was a really good one. So part of this is not just like, yes, let's all embrace pleasure activism and emergent strategy. Part of this is, how do you start getting people on board with it who then can trickle out, which is part of union organizing as well, right? Like when you're trying to unionize a shop, you don't always just go to the people who most believe in the union. You have to figure out who actually has the most influence with other people. And you have to get them on board sort of with narrative storytelling, all this stuff. Like anyone who's done organizing knows this. But because of that, you have to be able to willing to change with the people who are in the room. And some of my fears is kind of some of the dogmatism in radical theology and political theology and liberal theology and leftist politics and like anything we're doing, same thing on the right, is the program takes precedence over the people, which to me is never, might work short term, but it is never a long-term strategy.
So you have used this language of process, and so I wanted to talk a little bit about Whitehead, if that's okay, because I have to admit, as I was like working through the book, I sort of did not see that coming when I got to that chapter, and suddenly it was, and not only Whitehead, but Whitehead paired with Foucault, sort of like the philosophical odd couple, if ever there was one. And so I was wondering if you could talk about this role of of process theology, and particularly from like a very theological perspective. Because I'm thinking, for example, you mentioned that you sort of straddle the line between pantheism and panentheism, which feels very much in this sort of Whiteheadian water. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, great. I also just saw that Bill Connolly's new book ends with a chapter on Whitehead and Foucault, which made me feel like, oh, I'm ahead of the curve. But yes, they're an odd couple to put together. And again, my kind of methodology of what sticks to me, like I was reading History of Madness and reading all this stuff from Foucault about becoming again what we never were, and reading Lynn Huffer on Foucault, which is a great book called Mad for Foucault, and kind of that sort of salvage work. And then also reading Whitehead and Isabel Stanger's work on Whitehead, and kind of Whitehead's idea that God has the tender care that nothing be lost. So Huffer has this idea that in Foucault there's kind of an erotics of care through an erotics of listening and a paying attention again to like those ghosts. And then Stanger's has this sense of Whitehead, and Whitehead himself writes that like Whitehead's dipolar God is about the tender care that nothing be lost. So these sort of systems of care were sort of sticking out to me while I was reading, and I just attempted to put them together, and I'll leave it up to the readers how successful or not it was. But for me, process has always been kind of like a love-hate relationship, which might say something about like what it means to be a doctoral student, since Catherine Keller was my doctoral advisor. Well, I love Catherine, it's not a knock on Catherine, but just that like you are struggling for your own identity within a system when you're a doctoral student. And part of my concern always with process theology was the potential for teleological positivity, right? That like we will keep going towards ever greater, higher orders of harmony and beauty, and like God is on the side of that ever greater order, and we're gonna maybe sort of move that way. I think that can be a fair reading of process theology, particularly read through Christian theological interpretations of process, but I don't think it's as fair of a reading of Whitehead. So I think for Whitehead, there's always a chance we're actually going to process to worse orders, right? That process itself is inherently a risk. I think Whitehead would say God, or sort of his sense of God, is on the side of greater adventure, which leads to greater contrast, which leads to more higher levels of harmony and beauty. But not that that's where we're definitely going to go. Like that is ultimately a risk. The whole point of process is that there is not a stable teleology or telos. So for me, that kind of theological thinking where we can say it's worth the fight to kind of keep revealing these contrasts, keep salvaging new ways of thinking beauty, different ways of thinking harmony, or old ways made new again, is a risk worth taking. It's not going to be okay with me if we think the risk will absolutely lead to certainty, right? Everything for Whitehead and for Foucault, like for Derrida, what like could come back to you, what you could get back from the process could kill you, right? This is all order, all sort of destruction of order for Whitehead is the creation of a new order. You're always going to have to frustrate orders over and over again. That's kind of the point of the process. So for me, Whitehead was really helpful in that way, in that Whitehead gives me a God who allows us to constantly frustrate order, and who also allows that we might salvage the parts of ourselves that never became. Not because we can never get back to something. Once something's gone and not ingressed for Whitehead, not become, you can't get that specific thing back. But God's consequential nature salvages potential, which means that like we always have the opportunity to frustrate order anew. And so for me, that's where like kind of that hope encased in uncertainty, or that survivance or salvage comes in terms of God. Probably if I was doing like a PhD in philosophy, I like wouldn't have needed God. But I felt like in kind of thinking about theology, what's the closest metaphor for God that works for this theology I'm creating? And for me, a kind of processual salvager from the garbage heap, which is what I see Whitehead's God as being, fit the best. Certainly on the panel in my book at AAR, like that was one of the places that's like most of the panelists had the most trouble with that chapter because they worried that it was actually creating a salvation. And I take that really seriously, and that might be true. I say the pantheism, panentheism thing is because so for anyone who hasn't read Mary Jane Rubenstein's Pantheologies, you should. I'm sort of utterly convinced by her at this point to move purely into pantheism, but a William Jamesian pantheism as opposed to a Spinozist pantheism, because the Jamesian pantheism, as Rubenstein reads it, is one in which difference matters. So my concern of pantheism is kind of a flattening of difference, where things become kind of more monadic and there's like a oneness to the all that is God and nature. Panentheism allows for some separation, right? It allows that like God and nature are in relation, which also means you and I can be in relationship. So that's what it was like, okay, I'll say panentheism for me. What Rubenstein argues is that actually William James offers us a pantheism that does not need the end. It doesn't need this transcendent God, and yet it's difference all the way down. And that's the kind of theology I would want to rest in if I had to pick a label.
So as you're describing that, you said that this is the metaphor for God that works for me.
Yeah.
And so we want to let you go in a moment, but there was one of our forum moderators couldn't be here, Kit, but she left a question here that I think delves into this question, because I think that idea of works for me brings up this question of truth. So this is, it's a pretty heavy kind of epistemological question. So I'm just going to read through the question here. Would you classify your work toward a political theology of affect as motivist? That is, the belief that truth claims are fundamentally expressions of personal feeling, rather than a claim about the representation of objective reality? If not, how would you evaluate the relationship between theology as you practice it and truth? It seems that your work is more anthropological than didactic. Is this a fair observation?
Yeah, so I was thinking a lot about that since I read the question from Kit. I'm certainly not looking for solid objective truth. And I think there's part of me that's really drawn to Anne Savekovich quotes Audre Lorde, who says, like, taking seriously, this is a paraphrase, but taking seriously the sense that it feels right to me as a fair epistemological way to move about the world. So I start to write in that kind of vein, and then Donald Trump happens, and we have things like alternative facts, and kind of the desire and need for truth feels more pressing, and we sort of have this. Again, I mean, I think it's kind of a red herring to blame postmodernists for Trump, but there is this real alive question from affect theory of like, okay, if I say like we have to follow our negative emotions where they are, like how does that not also mean white resentment doesn't get to be followed where it goes, right? Like how do you make the decision between liberative or resistant depression and, white male depression at the Browning of America or something like that. And I don't have a clear solution to that problem. I really like, Catherine Keller has a line from an essay where she says she's not looking for capital T truth claims, but she's looking for trustier propositions or trusty propositions. So I would say like my theology is trying to be trusty. It's not trying to tell a closed off truth, but it's trying to find ways to be trustier. And that goes again to grave attending. Like, how can I be trusty with my assertion about what my whiteness means or what my citizenship means if I'm not allowing myself to be haunted by those who don't fit into those categories? If I'm not trying to read in canons outside of what I was always told were the trustiest canons. So I'm not trying to claim truth, but I am trying to earn trust, and I'm trying to propose thought experiments and try out if they feel trusty to others whose kind of ethics or politics I align with. So again, it's hopefully a book that's a communal dialogue. The book does not end like at all with a solution. Like it's the last lines are like, how do you hold the unholdable or something like that? Like it's not an end. But I hope it's trusty in its attention to those left unacknowledged in our fields of political theology and radical theology. That's like at least a first step in kind of trust building.
Excellent. Well, we want to thank you so much for spending this time with us. We want to, of course, end by encouraging everyone who views this when we post it to go out and purchase Grave Attending, A Political Theology for the Unredeemed. I just finished it about an hour and 15 minutes ago, so I can give it the very recent affirmative thumbs up. And so thank you so much for giving us all of your time.
Thank you, Karen.
Thank you guys. Really appreciate it. It's been fun.
All right.